Well, good morning, everyone. And Karen, the floor is yours. You are the host today.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our fourth CCA weekly chat. My name is Karen Fasado, and I'm a board member of the CCA Alberta. As you know, the CCA Alberta is here to help facilitate networking opportunities for the Alberta business community, as well as building linkages with government decision makers and business representatives in Latin America and the Caribbean markets. We continually strive to organize activities that address issues which are both timely and pertinent to Alberta business. Our events seek to enhance your understanding of the current business climate in the region. Our weekly chat events are designed to keep you as up to date as possible on the rapidly changing circumstances in the region. Today, we are very pleased to have Leonardo Beltran with us to talk about sustainable energy. Miguel Cortines and I will moderate the discussion and field questions from our audience. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Miguel, to introduce our guest.
Thank you very much, Karen, and welcome everyone that is joining us this morning. And welcome, Leonardo. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. We really appreciate your participation. Leonardo Beltran is a member of the Board of Sustainable Energy for All and Fundación por México. He's also a member of the Experts Network of the World Economic Forum. He has expertise of over 20 years. In academia, Mr. Beltran is a non-resident fellow at the Institute of the Americas, executive fellow and member of the advisory committee of the Extractive Resources Governance Program of the School of Public Policy of the University of Calgary, and member of the editorial committee of ENERLAC from the Latin American Energy Organization, OLADI. In his private practice, he's currently a consultant to the Inter-American Development Bank, OLADI, and the World Bank. In the public sector, he serves in the Department of Energy of the Government of Mexico as Deputy Secretary for Planning and Energy Transition from 2012 to 2018. And he was Director for Information and Energy Studies and Director for International Negotiations. In the private sector, he was a consultant with BBVA Bancomer from 2000 to 2003. And Mr. Beltran has been a consultant to different organizations, including the United Nations Industrial Development. He holds a master's in public administration in international development from Harvard Kennedy School, a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM, and studied law at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Bienvenido, Leonardo, welcome here. And before we start, I think you are going to share a presentation with us, but before we start with that, probably we want to ask you, tell us more about the work that you do with all these organizations that I mentioned, with Sustainable Energy and with the Institute of Americas. Just very briefly, maybe you can share with us a little bit.
Thanks very much, Miguel. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and thanks very much, Karen. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my views with the council. You know, I have a small PowerPoint presentation on an analytical framework that I think it's useful to have some analysis of different jurisdictions and that you can compare amongst each other. And we'll talk a little bit about Mexico, but you know, regarding what I do with these different organizations, in particular, I would highlight the work that I do for Sustainable Energy for All, which is a quasi-international organization. The purpose of this initiative is to advise the United Nations Secretary General on on his decisions towards the energy sector and how to achieve Sustainable Development Goal number 7. So as part of the board of the organization, my role is to make sure that I bring to the table the viewpoint from Latin America and the Caribbean, and that the work of this organization actually focus a little bit more on what's happening in LATAM. And just day-to-day review the different studies that are conducted with the staff of the organization, basically focusing on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, and access to energy services, which is the gist of the goal number 7 of the SDGs. So I would point you to the website of these organizations, www. Of this organization, se4all.org. And you can see there's a vast wealth of resources, from research to policy advice, and some various opportunities to engage with this organization and with the work of the UN system as a whole. And probably in the academic sector, which is part of what we are doing right now, is the opportunity to share my viewpoint from the experience that I got from the public sector, and in particular on energy and basically the energy transition. So I have the chance to be associated with this think tank in California, the Institute of the Americas, and the University of Calgary. And in both these responsibilities, my role is to write my opinions over different topics, but in particular, how to advance the energy transition, which is now the mainstream of the energy sector. And basically, that's it.
Excellent. Well, you are free to share your presentation, and we are eager to hear from you and to learn from you.
Perfect, Miguel. So I will share it now. And can you see the presentation?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so this is the analytical framework that I think it's very useful to analyze and compare jurisdictions. First, it's called the Energy Transition Index, and basically is an analytical framework that was developed under work of the World Economic Forum. And they set up this expert network, and they do works in different councils. So there was a council on energy and a council on energy transition that helped in putting this framework to work under that umbrella. So first, the system performance imperatives that are reflected into the Energy Transition Index is any energy system should have these 3 imperatives or 3 pillars. First, it has to contribute or to be based upon security and access to energy services. It has to be environmentally sustainable, and it has to promote economic development and growth. So without any of these 3 elements, a system performance is subpar. So we have to make sure that we contribute to these 3 items to make sure that we are transitioning in a just and an efficient manner in the energy sector. Now, there are 6 elements that contribute to this performance and to the 3 pillars. And I will just briefly mention, but basically you need to have a structure that is conducive for the energy system in order to attract capital and investment, that the rules of the game or the regulation and the political commitment is present, that you have an architectural, an institutional architecture and governance that it's conducive for the performance for assessing the performance of the energy sector, and infrastructure and innovative business environments that you can allow for new areas of knowledge be developing in this system, stimulating knowledge production, but particularly innovation, and certainly human capital and consumer participation. Of course, if you do not have access to energy services, but or if you do not have access to brain power, and you do not take into account the consumers, certainly those are dimensions that would not contribute to the system performance that we are envisioning. So that's the basic framework that I wanted to share with you in order to compare the different jurisdictions. Now, this work, again, was done by the World Economic Forum, and it's available at their website. But I wanted to highlight the composition, or how they categorize the different countries into the energy transition. And according to the system performance, they qualify their performance under the 3 pillars that I mentioned, and the transition readiness score, that all of these 6 dimensions that are enabling to a conducive environment for the energy transition reflect upon each jurisdiction. So in this case, there are 4 quadrants. The one of leading countries, which basically rank high in the transition readiness score. So each of the 6 enabling conditions are worked out somehow. And the system performance in terms of sustainability, in terms of economic growth, and in terms of security and access are faring well in these countries. So we can see here Mexico in the borderline, but we can see as well here Canada, of course, and several other jurisdictions. There are leapfrog countries which in the transition readiness score, they are high, but there are still challenges in the system performance score. Or countries with potential challenges, which in terms of the score is relevant, but the enabling conditions are somehow constrained for the development of these jurisdictions. And then finally, the lower table, which is countries that fare low in the transition readiness score and in the system performance score. So as you can see, it's quite relevant to see our region faring among the leading countries. So now I will focus a little bit more on Mexico with this framework, knowing that on the energy transition and about this exercise that is conducted independently for the World Economic Forum, Mexico is still one of the leaders in the energy transition. So there's a question for me, and of course there are many other questions, but perhaps the first one that I would like to make is, does it make sense, the energy transition? I mean, if you are looking into different jurisdictions and you're starting to hear that the move is moving towards that direction, why would you care if you are in a jurisdiction that relies basically on conventional sources of energy? Does it make sense? Well, let me say, I took this graph from a study that was conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers with information from several sources. And in fact, the energy transition is a market outcome. Why? Because here you can see we are comparing clean energy and conventional energy. And the sources that we are comparing are wind, solar PV, geothermal, hydro, coal, combined cycle, natural gas, and turbo gas. And so the first column, it speaks about the capital expenditure required in dollars per kilowatt hour to set up a facility of any of these sources. So as you can see here, probably the most competitive are combined cycle and turbo gas. And not so distant, but still a little over is solar PV against combined cycle and turbo gas. So in terms of the capital expenditure, as you can see here, it's basically we are still a little bit behind conventional energy in terms of clean energy. Now, what happens with operational expenditure? Well, in terms of operational expenditure, basically the leaders here are clean energy. Why? Because it's practically zero, the operational expenditure of a unit of wind or solar or geothermal, the heat extracted from underground of the earth, and the hydro is somewhat competitive, but compared to these other sources, still is really high. Now, if you add these two elements into the levelized cost of energy, or a way to compare what's the overall cost of capex, opex, and given a time frame, what you can see is basically the clean sources are the ones that are more competitive than traditional sources. So that's why the market is moving towards that direction, because all in terms of cost, it's much more competitive today, wind and solar and probably geothermal, than the rest of the sources. So again, it's not something like a fad that people are starting to look or to talk about this because it's fashionable, but because it makes sense. It makes economic sense. It makes environmental sense, and overall, it makes sense towards the energy transition. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, well, you can see here that the emissions per unit of each of these resources are 0, and they are expected to be 0 over the next 15 years or so, which are infinitely lower than any of these other sources. Perhaps turbo gas, not so much, because it's very limited, the applications we have there. But the fact still remains that if we are using coal or natural gas, there's a huge contribution of GHG emissions towards the Mexican electricity system, for instance. So that would be the main point of this graph in terms of what we why in fact makes sense to go into the energy transition for Mexico. Now, what's the energy transition policy in Mexico? Well, if you see formally into pieces of legislation in Mexico and into the international agreements that Mexico has is being part of, Mexico has two main goals. First, on clean energy, which is by 2024, Mexico has to produce 35% of their energy from clean sources. In 2033, almost 40%, and in 2050, 50%. Half of the needs of the country would have to be met by clean sources of energy. Now, the other component, which is very relevant and oftentimes is neglected, is energy efficiency. And Mexico is one of the few countries that actually has an energy efficiency goal into their legislation. And it's reflected here in the next 15 years up to 2035. There's a goal to reduce energy intensity or the energy used to produce 1 unit of product should be reduced 2.2% per year. And from 2035 up to 2050, that has to be increased all the way to 2.5%, which is part of what the administration sees as relevant to comply with their environmental commitments under the UNFCCC framework. So this is already reflected into domestic law and is also reflected into the commitments made by the Mexican government before different organizations and bilateral, multilateral countries. Now, the official outlook on power generation, how does that those goals translate into power generation in Mexico? Well, here you can see this graph. It's an outlook that it's reflected into the newest program for the development of the electric system in Mexico, Prodecen 2020-2034. And it has this annex, which basically reports the potential of mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions from the from the power sector. And well, basically, what you can see here is around 80% of the generation, but or in other words, it almost doubled the needs of the country in the following 15 years, or 2/3, basically. There would be a very small growth of hydroelectric resources. There would be, in relative and in absolute terms, an important increase in PV, photovoltaic, and wind power from 2020 all the way to 2034. But the most important component, it will remain combined cycle or natural gas. So this is very useful to see that even though there are commitments in the legislation, the vision of the energy or of the power sector is to continue to grow or to continue to feed this growth with the majority, or more than 50% of that growth, would have to come from sources of energy that are not as clean as we would think of with the goals. So this is a flag to see, but it's very relevant also that we see there would be a doubling of the sources focused on wind and photovoltaic. And perhaps also worth mention is the increase in the share of nuclear power by the end of the period. Certainly, that's a long-term vision, and it depends on many things. But it's useful to see that in the first third of the current administration, they are envisioning to see in 15 years an increase in nuclear power. So that's how is translated the mandates of the legal framework and international agreements into Mexico. Now, in real terms, what does that mean? That there would be available opportunities to invest in Mexico in this administration from today all the way to 2024. And these are the projects that the CFE, the Federal Electricity Commission, or the National Electric Utility, would be developing in these 3 years, these 3-4 years. Basically, 4 gigawatts of new power plants focused on or sourced by natural gas. So there is a good business opportunity to come in and feed this growth in the power sector. One, because it's something that the administration is sending the signal that they would do. Second, because the administration is backing and trying to strengthen the position of the state productive enterprises, CFE in the power sector and Pemex in the hydrocarbon sector. And thirdly, because the national utility, CFE, would need to be complementing their knowledge and expertise with technology and finance. So here you have a good opportunity to invest in Mexico in the following 3 years. And of course, there are these other opportunities that are relatively minor, but overall, there would be somewhere between 4 to 6 billion billion US dollars of opportunity to invest in the next 3 years in Mexico in these sources. And from 2024 onwards, what they are forecasting or envisioning for the development of the power sector is basically to add more nuclear and more hydro resources to meet the clean generation goals that the country has as reflected into their domestic and international commitments. So this is really interesting because certainly, natural gas will play a role here, but if there's no change in the next political cycle in administration, this will happen, or it's likely that this happens, and Mexico will be in that path to meet the clean generation goals that we have set forth in the legislation. But it's important because this is very technologically challenging nuclear and combined cycles. In hydropower, I know that Canada has developed a very cutting-edge technology for run of the river and some other technologies to collect hydro resources and to power the grid. So again, there would be plenty of opportunities in the next decade for Canadian companies to explore opportunities with the current administration and next administration, but make sure that the new companies and these new opportunities are channeling their efforts towards technologies that would be supportive of the energy transition. And that's what I had in mind for this presentation, Karen and Miguel.
Thank you, Leo. I have a question. On your slide number 9, where you have the sort of components of power generation growth, it's broken out by the different types of power generation sources. I'm curious, geothermal has a very sort of steady line. It doesn't seem to grow very much over the years. And you and I have spoken about geothermal in the past. And I'm curious why geothermal isn't projected to grow more, given that Mexico is probably one of the world's richest in terms of geothermal resources. And it also answers the problems of the intermittency that we see with wind and solar.
Well, first, let me say that I am not associated with the current administration, so I wouldn't know exactly why they did not include geothermal as more prominent into their planning. But my guess is because they have now envisioned a viewpoint much more, or they have incorporated a vision that it's much more focused on hydrocarbon resources than clean resources. So, the president has expressed, well, the president comes from a state that it's relying upon hydrocarbons, the state of Tabasco. Pemex is the company that has fed his vision and a lot of the growth of that particular state. And the other state productive enterprise has, basically these two stances, to go more on clean sources and start phasing out hydrocarbon resources, or to continue to move towards this direction. And it's completely certain that the outlook of this administration and the president is much more focused on helping develop the resources of the state productive enterprises, which have developed expertise, have based their development in exploiting hydrocarbon resources, and that's consistent with that viewpoint. Now, would it make sense to explore geothermal resources? Certainly. We have discussed that in other occasions, but perhaps let me say that Mexico today is the 5th largest geothermal producer worldwide. So it's behind, Philippines, Indonesia, not sure if, well, certainly the US, but not sure which one is the fourth, probably New Zealand or Japan, I do not recall right now, and then Mexico. And in terms of the availability of potential resources of geothermal, there's an order of magnitude still to take advantage of. So there's room to grow one order of magnitude, or to multiply by a factor of 10 the existing capacity in Mexico. And that's envisioning, certifying and certifying the potential and the existing resources of current fields. So for me, it's intriguing why they did not include much more geothermal resources. And my explanation would be, from the internal conversations, they align more to a vision much more traditional.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. I'm a big champion of geothermal, so I would love to see more.
Yeah, absolutely. And me too. No, in Mexico, we had the chance to last administration to promote an energy reform that included a geothermal act. So Mexico is one of the few countries that has an act specially dedicated to one particular resource, and was because of the potential that we see in that resource, not only in terms of the quality of the resource, because it's ample, it's available, and it's competitive, but also because of the contribution that could have towards mitigation and adaptation of climate change. Geothermal, as we saw in the previous slides, it has zero contribution towards GHG emissions. So, it only makes sense to continue to explore clean sources of, or cleaner and clean sources of energy.
I have a question, Leonardo, and maybe together with the comment of Benigno here. How is I know in Mexico, they are approving right now a new laws for the electricity. How this is going to impact basically the agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular for energy, but I know that Mexico is committed as well to the 2030 agenda, but also they are approving these new laws. But how do you see it's going to create an impact, and how they are going to balance in some way to still achieve the goals for 2030 or 2050, depends on the different goals?
Well, let me say that the Senate has just approved the legislation as presented by the lower chamber. So the discussion took place yesterday, and in the energy, climate change, and another commission, I don't recall the other one right now, but they were jointly discussing the proposal, and it was approved, basically as the president presented the proposal. And this proposal is interesting in the sense that reflects exactly this vision of the president for the energy sector. He wants to support the development and strengthening of the state productive enterprises. And in particular, in the power industry, what he has submitted for Congress approval is that basically CFE does not have to compete with the other market participants. So whatever they generate would be fed into the system, whether if it's clean or if it's competitive in terms of prices. No? So basically, he's excluding the state productive enterprise from the rules of the game of the wholesale electricity market in the country. Naturally, this in a first iteration would seem to be positive for CFE because now they wouldn't have to compete. But certainly that would have a cost into the wholesale electricity system. In terms of the system now would have to pay for whatever resource is fed by CFE. And as we have seen the levelized cost of energy, CFE has assets that are less competitive than new assets and cleaner sources of energy and clean sources of energy. So this will be translated directly into an increase in power, in electricity costs. Second, it distorts the rules of the game of the wholesale electricity market, in which there were, investments in the order of $8.6 billion US as a result of the auctions held in the previous administration. And thirdly, given that it will be impacting these, it's obvious that the incumbents would be challenging the new legislation in courts. And the precedent is that the Supreme Court has overturned the policies of this administration. So what we would going to see is basically a legal battle between market participants and the administration. Mm-hmm. But again, let me say, in terms of the legal framework, there has not been any instance in which any contract has been repelled or repudiated. The rules of the game have been reflected into the contracts, and the participants or the parties to those contracts have been abiding by the provisions inserted in those contracts. So in terms of the legal sanctity of the contracts, it has been, as of now, observed.
Thank you, Leonardo. Karen, you want to ask another question, or probably from the public as well? We have from the audience some questions.
Yeah, I mean, I have questions, but I think we should share the time with our audience and keep it as interactive as possible. There's a question from Mauricio Lopez Darden. Ought we not to take GHG emissions regarding the construction of equipment such as windmills into consideration in order to make a fair comparison?
Certainly, today there are different initiatives in which the idea is to quantify, from the sourcing of the different materials all the way into disposal once the life cycle has ended, to quantify the GHG emissions of all that cycle. Certainly, that would be the best way to approach GHG emissions. As of today, that's advancing, but certainly there's plenty of opportunity to do some research and to strengthen the data available to make those comparisons. So yes, I fully agree with that. And in particular, in Europe, they have been developing a lot of research pieces that work on this and try to make up for the lack of information to actually assess the net impact of a particular resource. But in general, what we can say is that in terms of the overall impact, it seems to be higher from hydrocarbon resources than from clean sources. No?
Thank you, Leonardo. Miguel, do you want to address the next question?
Yeah, we have, it's related to what previously asked, but Carlos Solórzano is asking about from resources and international commitments, the opportunities are there, but what about the political stability and rule of law? How is the electrical reform being discussed at the Senate? Well, it's already approved, will impact the energy sector. And probably I could complement that with what are the, because you mentioned already that it's going to be challenges in the court of law, but where do you see the opportunities that, assuming that we have to adopt a new law, what are the opportunities that are going to be for Canadian companies, for international companies basically to work with Mexico, even in the federal level, maybe in the provincial level, or probably with the private sector? How do you see, Leonardo?
Well, certainly given the impetus and the ideology of this administration, in the next 3-4 years, the opportunities rely on partnering with CFE and Pemex. And so basically this opportunity of new combined cycle power plants are available opportunities for international investors that would not experience any hiccup of the participation in the wholesale electricity market, because they will be partnering with the purveyor of choice of the government, no? CFE. Now, of course, if you would like to invest for supplying the wholesale electricity market, then there's an instance in which most probably there would not be investments because of this change in legislation. But of course, there are other opportunities to supply the private sector on a bilateral basis, no? So developing assets for one or a couple of consumers, and that would still be relevant. But I guess the opportunities are to partner with the CFE or to supply the needs of the private sector, but without taking into account or having a portion of those assets going into the wholesale electricity market because of this new legislation. But the opportunities are there, and probably you have been observing that there are investments happening in Mexico, and that's because you still need to supply the government, but you also still need to supply the private sector, no? So basically the loser here is the opportunity to partner in the wholesale electricity market.
Thank you, Leonardo. Karen?
We have a question from Mauricio Diaz. What are the plans or projects to capture or sequester the carbon associated with the development of thermal power plants?
Well, I do not work with this administration, so I really do not have something like an insight from the administration. But what I can say is that internationally, there's plenty of reports, and particular the latest report produced by the United Nations, actually sees carbon capture use and storage as necessary, although not sufficient, to see a future where the world meets this 1.5 degrees target. No? So certainly in many areas, you will continue to see development of these type of projects. And now, there's also discussions about how to reduce the environmental footprint of these other resources. So, hydrogen has came up as one of those opportunities. And there's the discussion about, blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, green hydrogen. So there's plenty of discussion about that. In sectors where there are a lot of heavy industry and industry in general with high intensities of energy usage, and particularly focused on petrochemicals and this type of industry, there's an opportunity there to do CCS, certain CCUS, CCS and CCUS, no, of course. But in Mexico, it's rather limited. Now, there's a roadmap for CCS implementation in Mexico. It's available on the website. That was done in the previous administration. There was an innovation center focused on building capacity and in terms of talent development, but also in terms of research and development, focusing on doing a couple of pilots, one for enhanced oil recovery with Pemex, another one for power production with CFE, and then work on the legal framework, what would be needed to make it compatible with environmental commitments. So there's a lot of knowledge. Even we do have an assessment of the potential available for storage in Mexico in saline aquifers. And it's something that was studied here in Mexico, but in terms of moving towards implementation and private sector participation, I do not think this administration is thinking of that. Although in terms of hydrogen, in the new policy document, there's a mention that they would start assessing what's the potential in CFE.
Excellent, Leonardo. This question from Jody, I think is related to what you already mentioned, but I'm just going to put it here. Is it from Jody Antor? What is the perception of carbon capture and storage combined with natural gas, thermal electricity generation for low to zero carbon emissions?
Yes, again, I mean, the resources are there, these documents, these policy documents and that, but it seems that, and let me say this, right now, the financial situation of the state productive enterprises are dire. So they are focusing now on things that try to bring them a little bit more bang for their buck, but considering that there would not be much more resources to do different types of things. So I guess to say it directly, I don't think there's right now even willing or the financial resources available to go into this path. Probably if there's an agreement at the international level, that would be, I mean, like in the UNFCCC or there's available some sources from the Green Climate Fund or any other international financial mechanism, probably there could be an interest, but certainly not to do that domestically only.
Thank you, Leonardo. I think there was a question from Benigno in the chat room. What is your, I think that you may have already addressed this. What is your take on hydrogen as an alternative for energy transition?
Well, yes, I mentioned a little bit about that. Right now, there's a new association here, trade association, focused on green hydrogen. There's a mention in the business plan of CFE, but that's what there is available as of now. It's just a narrative for the moment, and there are no specific plans other than probably, in transport in Mexico City, probably there are 1 or 2 units using hydrogen, but other than that is in very early stages, the discussion here. In terms of the potential worldwide, certainly this is a very good discussion that is happening everywhere. There are pilot projects happening as of now. There's one in Europe, in a commercial power project in Netherlands, in Spain. There's a lot of support from international financial organizations in the southern part of Latin America, in Chile, for instance. They have developed a roadmap. They are starting to work with a new research innovation center that has been set up in Chile, and they would be helping in developing a pilot project. But in Latin America, I think it's in the research and development stage. And in Europe, probably is about to become commercial. And in Asia as well, in some parts of Asia, Japan and probably China.
Yeah, I think we have time.
We have 1 minute left, Karen.
Yes, and I think there's one more question from our audience, and it's from Mauricio Diaz. Do you envisage a change of energy policy in Mexico influenced by the U.S. Biden administration?
Well, I mean, the energy policy of the administration has been already reflected into the policy documents that are published. So I guess in that regard, is rather difficult that there's an outside pressure to change existing policy or that policy in particular, no? Because this is just as the way it is set up, the legal framework. At the beginning of the administration, all the policy documents have to be put together in a participatory process and then publish that, and that would be the policy for the administration. Now, that does not mean that it's a static document. Of course, it's a dynamic document, and there are commitments and interactions with relevant stakeholders that can feed and strengthen or change a little bit course of existing policy. So in that sense, actually from the discussion that President Biden and President López Obrador held yesterday, there was a mention that they would focus on short-term pollutants for the climate policy and on energy efficiency. So that's very positive, which they have agreed in their first interaction to work on energy efficiency as a whole between US and Mexico. So I guess in that sense, yes, certainly we are observing formally that there's some movement in energy policy because of this focus of the interaction between the two administrations. No?
Thank you, Leonardo. Well, we are close to the program. I just want to remind everybody, well, first to thank you, Leonardo, for the time to be here with us. I think it's a very, very interesting conversation and a continuing conversation that is happening in Mexico. And I'm very positive that still there are opportunities for Canadian companies. We have a very, very important number of companies that are interested in Mexico, here in Alberta, in Canada. And I'm sure there will be some opportunities for you. And thank you, Leonardo. And just remind that next week we have our next weekly chat with Marcio Felix from Brazil to talk about the oil and gas sector in Brazil, the onshore sector in Brazil. And Karen, please, if you want to close the event, thank you.
Once again, thank you everybody for joining us for our number 4 in our weekly chat series. Looking forward to seeing you all again next week. And feel free to forward questions as you hear about what our content is. We like to prepare our speakers with some questions ahead of time, and we love our audience engagement. That's the whole purpose of these weekly chats, is to make them as engaging and as interactive as possible. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks very much, Karen.
Thank you,
Thanks very much, Miguel.